Tonight on Primetime Politics, upping the ante.
I am more optimistic now than I have ever been.
Alberta throws its weight behind a new pipeline proposal, adding more pressure on Ottawa to include a pipeline in the next tranche of national projects. Coming up, the Alberta Premier Danielle Smith will tell us more about her plan and answer early criticism from British Columbia. Also,
it is vital how we build.
The Prime Minister says national projects can only be built with Indigenous input, but do First Nations groups believe him? Coming up, the Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak will join the program. And the continuing controversy over the government's gun buyback program. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Well, Alberta's Premier has been very upfront, making no secret of her efforts to get a new pipeline built to the West Coast and leaning in on the Prime Minister to make that pipeline a priority for Ottawa. Well, today, Danielle Smith upped the ante on the issue by announcing Alberta will now work with 3 oil and gas companies to submit a proposal. This to the recently created Major Projects Office.
Without question, a new oil pipeline to the Northwest BC coast would have the greatest economic benefit of any new nation-building project. For example, had we completed the Northern Gateway project, the Energy East project, and the Keystone XL pipeline project, Canada's GDP today would be $55 billion stronger each and every year. We cannot let another opportunity of this economic magnitude pass us by again.
But the BC Premier has repeatedly criticized the idea of a pipeline, calling it at best theoretical because it has no major proponent.
The problem that we have is that Premier Smith continues to advance a project that is entirely taxpayer funded, has no private sector proponent, is not a real project, and is incredibly alarming to British Columbians, including First Nations along the coast, whose support is required for the success of the billions of dollars in real projects that I'm talking about.
Well, with more, we're now joined by the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith. Premier, thank you for making the time.
Yeah, nice to talk to you, Michael.
And you. So here we have Alberta. You're now going to act as the proponent of this new pipeline to the West Coast. There are 3 companies involved as an advisory role, to my understanding. Does this not just reinforce what Premier Eby has always said, that there's no real private interest in a new pipeline?
I would say that we have a market right now where it's difficult to attract private equity because of some of the bad laws that have been in place over the last 10 years. This is why I've talked to the Prime Minister about needing a grand bargain where we get a bitumen pipeline, the Pathways project to reduce emissions, but then also address the 9 bad laws. The way pipelines get built is that they get proponents willing to pledge barrels. Well, if you've got an emissions cap and a tanker ban at the moment, there aren't any proponents that are willing to pledge those barrels, which is part of the reason why it's difficult to get a pipeline built. It's a chicken and egg problem, and we're hoping to be able to cut through that so we can get this on the major projects list so we can attract private capital so that we can start the industry going again.
Okay, a chicken and egg problem, as you say, but here you have Premier Eby consistently saying that that he doesn't see this as a real proposal. Can you convince him that if you get rid of these roadblocks that there is a real deal possible?
Well, I look at the proposals on the first 5 projects that have been announced, and there's an aspirational project to build a major high-speed rail line between Quebec and Toronto, which I think is a great project. But it's pretty early days, and it's a pretty substantial project and would probably require a lot of government. That we're further along on this one because, first of all, Northern Gateway did have a proponent 10 years ago. We do have 3 companies at the table giving us technical advice who collectively have about 550 years of pipeline experience. So we believe that if we can get to a point where the government's willing to say yes, put it on the projects list, that we'll be able to attract that private capital. I've always been of the view that if this exercise is all about proposing projects that then federal taxpayer money has to be used to build, that's going to be a failure of the enterprise. What we need to do is we need to get some of the $500 billion worth of private investment that has been scared away from this country back into the country, and we think that we can be a catalyst to make that happen.
Okay, a catalyst, as you say, but let's go back to a little bit of what you were saying earlier, that there are still regulations that might be challenging for private corporations, and among them is that oil tanker ban along the BC West Coast. You've been raising it time and again. What's the latest on that? Is Ottawa willing to get rid of that ban?
We've been talking to them about how we would be able to either repeal or substantially revise some of the bad laws that are in place, and that has obviously been one of them. You can't build a new pipeline if you're not able to load it onto a ship, and so it is going to be up to Prime Minister Carney to give an indication of whether or not he's willing to work with us. We have told him that the grand bargain means it's all three. If we want to build the Pathways project to have lower emissions, which we do, you have to have a revenue source to pay for that, and the revenue source you get is from having a new revenue stream that comes from having a new market and a new pipeline so that you can generate those revenues. On top of that, though, we need to be able to address these 9 laws so that we have the proponents, our Cenovus and CNRL, Imperial, and various others, willing to expand production so that they can fill the pipeline and get those products to market. That's how it has worked historically, is that when we did have a private sector proponent with confidence, they would go out to the market, get barrels pledged, and then they'd be able to go to the banks and the equity markets in order to get the dollars to invest. The federal government, with their bad laws, have interfered in that process. So if we're going to be serious about making a change so that we can attract private capital back, those are the things that are going to have to be changed. So that's what I'm working on with the federal government, and I hope we make some progress.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also mentioned Northern Gateway, the past proposal from like over 10 years ago, but that was met with some real opposition from environmental groups and Indigenous leadership. How will this proposal, and I know you're still going to work on it, but how do you see this proposal addressing those issues so they don't actually become oppositional concerns?
Well, our beginning point has always been that there needs to be ownership from Indigenous nations. And it has to be at the early stages. So one of the first things that my Indigenous Relations Minister, Rajan Sani, did on Monday was to call Indigenous leaders and let them know that this was going to be announced today and that we want to partner with them on it. She's already paid a visit to Port of Prince Rupert and spoken with some of the leadership that is local there as well. And we're intending to build the relationships, identify the issues, and to make sure that Indigenous nations are full partners in the development of this pipeline proposal. So we did, looking back historically, there were 38 nations that had been community benefits partners in the original Northern Gateway pipeline project. We have, in the meantime, seen that Coastal GasLink was developed, as well as several LNG projects. Trans Mountain was developed and expanded. And so we have had some success in being able to move projects forward, but there's been at great expense. And in the case of Trans Mountain, it went probably about $10 billion beyond what it should have, just because we didn't have a private proponent. That's why we don't think that these are the kinds of projects that should be built by government. We believe that if we create the right environment, the private sector will build them, because the case is so strong for being able to access new markets, particularly in Asia. We know that our Asian partners have already received some of our product. They want more of it. And if we're going to diversify our customer base, that is the best opportunity to do so.
And the environmental concerns, is that about carbon capture? Is that a grand deal here, or is there other ways that you can address those concerns as well?
I mean, there's all kinds of ways. What I like about the Pathways project is they talk about carbon neutrality by 2050. They want to do carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We can build interties with our neighbors in Saskatchewan and British Columbia in order to decarbonize our grid, either with nuclear power or hydropower. We're very keen to look at those as potential options. And we also have direct air capture is one of the last mile proposals. So the CO2 is, of course, one issue. But there are also issues on the ground as you're developing out a project of this magnitude. With linear pipeline projects, you have to make sure that you're addressing local issues around land use, around Indigenous use, around hunting and trapping, and ensuring that those rights are respected. And so it's a long process that we have to go through, but I believe it's a very important one, a worthwhile one, and to have Indigenous ownership in it so that they have a long-term revenue stream to be able to address local concerns with their own source revenue. That, to me, is really a pathway to true economic reconciliation. So that's why we started there, is we want to be a catalyst to ensure that we've got Indigenous ownership as well.
Less than a minute left, but I have to ask, because you've been fairly confident that a pipeline will be included in the second tranche of national projects. What if it's not?
I would hope that we would have a pretty strong indication from the federal government about whether they're serious about acting on the things that they campaigned on. I saw with great interest that Prime Minister Mark Carney campaigned on being the strongest economy in the G7. He campaigned on being an energy superpower on both conventional as well as new energy. And so he's got to make good on those words, in my view. He got a mandate on that basis, and we're going to see whether or not he's going to make some of the changes that will allow us to get there. We're meeting him halfway, and so we're just asking for a partner in the federal government because it benefits all of us. If we can get a new pipeline to the coast, 1 million barrels a day, it would add $20 billion worth of annual GDP, and all of the revenues associated with that go to both the provincial government as well as the federal government. We think that this is a way that we can get a win-win-win all the way around, and these are the kinds of projects that we need to build more of.
Premier Smith, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you. See you again.
See you soon. Well, to Parliament Hill now, where the survivors' flag was raised earlier today. The flag first raised over 3 years ago over the parliamentary precinct. It is meant to honor all the children who were taken from their families and placed into residential schools. The flag itself also a reminder of the trauma created by that government policy, and in turn reminds the federal government of the commitments it has made to walk the path of reconciliation, an issue that is all the more pressing now with the development of major projects nationally.
We recognize that the journey to reconciliation does not follow a straight path, and it's not simple. It takes humility, it takes honesty, and it takes all of us. Powerful acts, sharing stories, raising this flag, move us forward in that journey. So to the survivors, again, thank you. Thank you for your truth, for your wisdom, and for your strength. What you were made to endure was deeply unjust and wrong, and it can never be forgotten.
And that was the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, Rebecca Alty, from earlier today. And joining us right now in studio is Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak, the National Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. Chief, good to see you again.
Thank you.
So the raising of the survivors' flag over Parliament Hill, once again, this does follow yesterday's commemoration ceremony for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And that's where I want to begin, because we heard the Prime Minister speak at yesterday's ceremony. Let's take a listen to a bit of what Mark Carney had to say.
Because, well, it's vital that we build. It's more important. It is vital how we build. With Indigenous leadership, Indigenous prosperity, Indigenous opportunity. These must be foundational from the start.
So again, the Prime Minister from yesterday essentially saying that when these national projects happen, they must happen with Indigenous consultation, Indigenous leadership. Are you encouraged by that language?
I'm always encouraged, I think, by governments and, successive, previous Prime Ministers, I'll say, and you kind of go back to people like Paul Martin, for instance, who really wanted to invest in the Kelowna Accord at one point, and even John Crutchan, I think, who had a love-hate relationship. Sometimes First Nations chiefs were pretty hard on him when he was Indian Affairs Minister, but I know that they would push him back sometimes, and he knew it, right, when we wanted to move on one piece or another. And then you look back at people like Stephen Harper, for instance, who did the apology for residential schools, and then you look back at the legacy of Justin Trudeau, who really set the bar high. And, we want to look to this Prime Minister to set that bar even higher. And, I'm thankful that he had met with chiefs this summer in July. But at the same time, we have a budget coming up in, November 2nd. And I think that that's going to be really telling on how this government wants to move forward. At the same time, I think, this Prime Minister, because, the bar is there, it's set. And, we look to him to make sure that those relationships are built stronger. And I know that trust is not always easy to come by, because the history of this country has not been kind to First Nations people.
And I hear what you're saying. The bar has been set, and at this point you're still waiting for a track record from Mark Carney. But I think for many Canadians, especially when you think back to Idle No More, the idea that Indigenous consultation can exist side by each with natural resource development, I think there's still a lot of skepticism about that in this country. Is that skepticism well placed, or has the relationship improved, do you think?
Well, I think it's validated, because I think trickle down economics, or the taking of resources on one side to benefit one side of the country, and to have now First Nations on First Nations here saying poverty is no longer should no longer be an option, and to start to question, to say because Canada wants to come in and build, but I mean, they've been building the past 150 years, and we're still seeing these huge gaps when it comes to housing and infrastructure. The gaps are far apart for First Nations and kids in our communities. When even say the new technology age, even just in the past few years of high-speed internet and access to cell phones, well, First Nations even in that are very left far behind it. We look to people like Murray Sinclair, who said education will get us into this mess. Education will get us out, and we truly believe that. But at the same time, trickle-down economics, as I said, isn't going to be the one-size-fits-all that solves everything. And there's got to be a committed, dedicated commitment from this Prime Minister and Prime Ministers after him to make sure that they're closing those gaps, that they're working towards it, because there's lots of communities without infrastructure when it comes to schools or housing, or just. But
are the national projects a way of achieving that type of equality that you're looking for, to close that infrastructure gap as you describe it?
Well, I think First Nations are, they're a little bit skeptical about it, because the last 150 years, like I said, of all the growth that has happened in this country hasn't always included First Nations people. And, it's been a trickle here and a trickle there. But, we need sustained investments and a real commitment and a real plan on closing the national infrastructure gap that First Nations people are feeling.
Does that come before or after a national project? Because I know the discussions are happening right now, and there's of course a lot of pressure on national projects. But again, up against that is held up as a goal, Indigenous consultation. But does that closing of gap has to happen before or after a national project?
I think the closing of the gap always has to. It's going to be. We need a plan. There was a plan from. Previous governments to close that gap to 2030. Right now, we don't even have an end date for that. And I think, if this government's serious, let's get, let's make that plan again and recommit to whether that's 2030 or beyond. But let's close that gap. And and I know
this would be parallel to any national project. You want a plan from the government, and what does that do? Buy goodwill for national projects?
Look, I think that, whether or not that's going to be for First Nations to decide. We don't even know where these national projects are, first of all. I mean, do you know where they are? You know what I mean? Like, we've been a few people. I was just meeting with Pierre Poilievre a moment ago, and he had asked, have you, we don't know, right? You hear whispers of projects here and there, but I think First Nations are waiting to see where are those projects and who do they impact. And I think the smart thing for any government to do would be to, this government, particularly right now, should be starting to have those big conversations with First Nations all over the country directly.
So encouraged by the words you heard yesterday, but still waiting for proof in the pudding. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think it's been a long time since the last federal budget. This upcoming federal budget, November 2nd, needs to make sure that there's investments in there for First Nations. And remembering that, the provinces are exempted right now from federal transfers on health, on education, from federal budget cuts. The first needs to be that also needs to be the case for First Nations.
Okay, well, we are watching. As you say, the budget is in early November. Cindy, appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you so very much.
Well, let's take a look now at the other stories happening in politics today. Tributes continue to be shared today for Nigel Wright. From 2011 to 2013, Wright served as Chief of Staff for Prime Minister Stephen Harper, resigning after being implicated in an expenses scandal that involved former Senator Mike Duffy. Wright died yesterday at the age of 62, and here's how his former boss is eulogizing him on social media today. Stephen Harper praising Wright for his love of country and belief in public service, and for being, quote, a man of faith who cared about his fellow citizens.
We have been very clear from the beginning that supply management is not a subject of negotiation with the Americans. It will not be, it is not or will never be on a negotiating table as we look at a review of the CUSMA agreement.
Well, that was Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc making it clear Canada's supply management system is not up for negotiation. The comments come after the Globe and Mail published a story today reporting that Ottawa may allow more U.S. dairy products onto Canadian shelves as the two countries look to renegotiate CUSMA. The U.S. has long complained about its limited access to Canada's dairy market. And finally, Canada is denying a request from Ontario theme park Marineland to ship 30 beluga whales to an amusement park in China. Fisheries and Oceans Minister Joanne Thompson stating she could not in good conscience approve an export that would, quote, perpetuate the treatment these belugas have endured. It is unclear what will happen to the whales next. Well, the government's program to buy back guns officially got underway this morning in Cape Breton, but that doesn't mean the controversy over that program has gone away, because here in Ottawa, while Conservative MPs continue to call on the Public Safety Minister to be fired, this after Gary Anandasangri was caught on tape questioning the program's worth and workability.
Will the Prime Minister fire his Minister of Public Safety? Will this Prime Minister finally fire this Minister today for not keeping Canadians safe?
When will the Prime Minister protect Canadians and fire this failed public safety style minister?
Now, earlier this week, I did speak about the minister and the gun buyback program with the Conservative Shadow Minister for Public Safety and the Government Secretary of State for Combatting Crime. Here is a bit of what each said.
I think the minister actually told the truth. He said this won't work. That's what he said behind closed doors, and we should take him at his word when he's speaking candidly. I want to get guns off the street too. Conservatives want to get guns off the streets. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So how should we go about getting guns off the street? In my view, a confiscation, and I say this as someone who's not a gun owner but prosecuted a number of offenses, nearly all, if not all of which involved illegal guns. This isn't the way to go about it, to strip hunters, people who are exercising their Indigenous rights to hunt, through a confiscation. Why? Because the illegal guns are themselves on the street. They're being possessed by people who don't have a right to possess them, by people who are using them for crimes, people who take a shotgun and saw it off. And what was the Liberal response? The Liberal response was to say one thing in public, to say another thing in private, and then to do things for political ends. We as Conservatives think that there should be common sense solutions. We should be repealing all of Bill C-5, which said that people who do drive-by shootings can serve their sentence on house arrest.
And this is C-5 of 2022. We should be clear. This is C-5 of 2022 that you're talking about.
I'm sorry. Yes, C-5 C-5 of 2022. For those who don't know, that was a sweeping gun bill. A bill that lowered penalties for gun crimes. So the Liberals on the one hand are going to say, you know what, we really need to take guns off the streets. 100% agree. And how are we going to do that? We're going to make it so that the most serious, hardened criminals, the people who are shooting up our neighborhoods, they can serve their sentences on house arrest. The two, they don't compute. It is hypocrisy on so many levels.
Okay, so how do you get the guns off the streets then, Mr. Caputo? If not a program like this, how do you do that?
Well, number one, you start having meaningful sentences to deter people and to denounce the conduct. Even if you look at the Supreme Court of Canada, that has generally not been super hard on crime, they've said that gun crime, people should be going to jail for handguns in terms of years. And yet the Liberals have not even heeded that advice. The other thing you do is you repeal the parts of C-75 that are very soft on bail. We've come out with a bill from my colleague Arpan Canada that says we need to address this. We need to make weapons prohibitions meaningful again. I can't tell you how many times I prosecuted people who were on weapons prohibitions, and that piece of paper was treated as just that, a piece of paper. We need meaningful consequences for those who deliberately thumb their nose at the law. The Liberals say they want to do that, but their actions don't back it up.
A couple of things to talk about. And I do want to begin with this gun buyback program because, you know, I was just speaking with the Conservative shadow critic for public safety, and, you know, I appreciate the pilot has gone ahead, but when you listen to Frank Caputo, he says essentially that recording of the public safety minister, you know, is an admission that this program will not work. What do you say to that?
Well, what I want to actually remind you and Canadians really is that the guns that are being bought back have already been banned. Those guns are now prohibited guns in Canada through a series of 3 different lists that came out over the last 5 years. And so I think it's only fair, especially, you know, to the responsible gun owners, which most are, that are holding these guns, that have stored them for all these years because they know they're prohibited weapons now. And it's time to compensate them. It's time to be able to give them, you know, fair compensation for the firearms they've been holding, and it's a way to get these assault-style firearms out of our communities, Michael. So I think it's an important step because it's a step we have to take. We have a whole bunch of guns that are now prohibited, and so there is a measure that needs to be taken next in order to resolve this issue in a fulsome way. And
listen, I hear what you're saying about compensation. I hear what you're saying about those that would be amenable to voluntarily giving back these guns again for compensation. But there will be those who do not. And I think that really is the criticism here about how workable is this? How do you enforce this law? And the fact that the public safety minister expressed doubt in the program, I think for Conservatives, and certainly the ones we've spoken to, underlines the unworkability of this program. What do you say to that?
Well, I think if, you know, I always hear that, you know, and I know this to be true too, that Canadians have a different gun culture than the U.S. They respect the rules of our licensing and what is and isn't allowed in Canada. And so I go back to the fact that these guns are now prohibited firearms, and there needs to be a measure to take in order to help all of these people. And for those that wish to hold on to it, there'd be different measures that would be taken because these are prohibited illegal weapons at this point, right? So yes, they were bought legally, and that's why there is this amnesty period. That is why there's a compensation plan. There's also an option to be able to permanently disable these firearms as well. So some may choose to take that option down the road. But all in all, they have to be removed from our communities.
And our thanks there to both Ruby Sahota and Frank Caputo. Their full interviews can be found on our website, cpac.ca, and on our YouTube channel. Well, that is our program for this Wednesday evening. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, have a great night.